Yo quiero decir que después
I'd like
que
to say that
John habló para nosotros,
after John has spoken for all of us,
después que estamos acompañando lo que pasa
we are
con las condiciones
following
naturales del planeta,
what's going on around the world
las
and the natural
transformaciones y la
conditions we're seeing around the world, the transformations,
capitalismo es
and
cada
the
vez
struggle against capitalism is more and more coherent.
para que tengamos
I'm going to
alguna idea
speak a bit about Brazil so that
que se
you can
hace,
get an idea about the destruction that is going on
condiciones de la reproducción de la naturaleza.
of the nature there. Last year,
Oeste de Brasil,
in the
en
center and east of Brazil,
Pantanal,
in the
tremendos
Pantanal swamp region, there were major fires,
que se tomó mucho tiempo para controlarse de
and it
todo.
took a long time to get them under control.
Al mismo tiempo, en la Amazonia,
At the same time, in the Amazon region,
también se
in the
quemó
northern region
miles y
of the
miles de
Amazon,
hectáreas de floresta.
thousands and thousands of hectares of forest were burned.
Con esto, una explotación salvaje
Alongside that, there was a savage overexploitation of the natural resources.
el corte de árboles para exportar la madera.
Trees were felled to export wood.
Periodo
So we're going through a period
amazónica,
in which the Amazon region,
un árbol
in which
producir de 300 a 1000
one
litros
tree
de
can
vapor de agua.
produce around 300 milliliters of water vapor,
Hay agua para el sur de Brasil.
is
Neste momento,
being
ya estamos
cut
capaz
and
de
depriving us of water in the south.
un control y reducción de la producción de la energía
We're seeing a control
en
and a reduction of the wind energy and hydroelectric
producción de
energy.
energía ahora
We're producing energy now
térmicas
with
más cara.
much more expensive thermal sources of energy.
Mucho
The cost of energy here in Brazil has increased manifold, even in the last month.
entrando también en un periodo
And we're also entering a period
sequías
of drought
por todo el Brasil.
in
La
all of
previsión
Brazil.
de lluvias para los 3-4 próximos meses será muy abajo.
We have had very low rainfall in the last few months. It's been much lower than average.
Entonces, la tendencia es que las áreas
So
van a ser quemadas,
the trend
ser aún más en los próximos meses.
is that the areas being burned, of course, won't grow again in the next few months. And this causes changes not only in Brazil, but throughout the world.
Entonces, vivimos en un periodo
So we're living in a capitalist society, in a very financialized time, and we're seeing production that's destroying nature. And is producing thousands of cubic meters of waste because of increasing overexploitation of nature. So I think it's increasingly necessary to transform capitalism, as John was saying, so that nature can live. In order to allow it to live, we must kill capitalism. Thank you. I think other participants have questions.
I also have the two questions. Yeah, and the first, John has discussed about the possibility of the how the environmental proletarian be the subject of history, and this is our future. And but I understand on the one hand we try to provide how can we has a revolutionary subject with a critical ecological mind. But at the same time, we also try to criticize the financialization and also financial capitalism. So how can we have two ways? On the one hand, we have a critical mind. On the other hand, we have a kind of critical mind to the financialization. For example, in China context, we have now emerging discussion about the experiment of the de-dollarization. And also, as I mentioned before, we try our best to promote the rural reconstruction movement. This is a kind of de-urbanization and re-ruralization. We try to produce a kind of subject, or we would like to name this subject as a food grower. Because it's quite different from the slogan in the 19th and 20th century, land to the tillers. We focus on the how can we cultivate a kind of food grower with a critical ecological mind, and also critical to the financialization. And of course, this kind of food grower has promoted the agroecology. So we try to have, cultivate a kind of subject with two double critical minds. So this is one question. And the other question is about the solidarity between the movements in the Global South. How can we, our movement connect to India, connect to Brazil, Cuba, and also Zapatista or Mexico, and also the progressive movement in the Global North. So we has a kind of emerging call for a kind of communist with a critical ecological mind and critical financial mind, maybe. It's a kind of manifesto, but how can this different subjects has a common solidarity ground? Yeah, so how can we build a kind of alliance? Not only, it's also difficult to build up a kind of alliance in the Global South, and also the cross-border to have some kind of connection with the Global North. So what is our common ground? Yeah, and that's us open to floor and or comments, suggestions.
These are difficult questions. I mostly talked about things from the ecological side, but of course, there's the economic side of our crisis too. Marx referred to production as the social metabolism between human beings and nature. And you can look at it as though there are two sides of the coin, one of which we call economic, the other one we call ecological. They're always connected, but we have different emphases if we look in one direction or the other. And it's a serious problem if we're looking at, say, a question of the environmental proletariat, or looking at ecological based struggle. How do we deal with issues of financialization? Basically, finance is the headquarters of capitalism. Finance is the headquarters of the corporations, and now we could say it's the headquarters of the entire capitalist system. It's imperialism. I usually refer to, in monthly review, we usually refer to the monopoly finance capital. meaning that we're still in the stage of monopoly capitalism, but it's switched to monopoly finance capital, where the giant corporations are integrated with and even dominated by the financial sector. And this is the reality. And when we talk about technology, we often talk now about fintech, because the technology is connected to the financial system. In terms of China is, of course, a good example, because China is more successful than any other country at resisting the full financialization of the dollar-dominated hegemonic imperial system. The recent Jack Ma, we call it that, crisis or event, was really a case of China intervening to make sure that it didn't lose control of its financial system. And actually, this is absolutely crucial to China's continued advance. It has to retain control of its financial system in a way other countries haven't been able to. And if it lets go of that, it's all over for the Chinese economy. It will be swamped by the imperial system, basically. So that's crucial, that China has to retain control over its own currency. And we could talk about this in terms of de-dollarization. The global South as a whole needs de-dollarization. And I think that in terms of the global South, financial control is now is really the forefront of imperialism. Ever since the early 1980s, we've seen how debt crises are used to control third world countries, and there's a whole dynamic at work there. One hope now is that China retains financial control and provides an alternative for a lot of countries in terms of finance. In the new Cold War, the imperial order led by the United States is trying to establish what they call a rule-based order, or consolidate what they call a rule-based international order, which is basically an order that is rooted in the institutions of the imperial institutions that the United States and NATO and we could say the triad of the United States, Canada, Europe, and Japan control. And that's part, they want to consolidate financial power and force China and other countries back into that box, as opposed to the United Nations system, which is, and those kinds of institutions that are much broader. So we have to understand the imperial struggle in that sense. And these things are linked. The ecological struggle, his struggle over the land, is linked to financial struggle. I mean, in financial terms, land is real estate. Some countries like China and Vietnam still have the land is socially owned, and makes a very big difference. In most countries, in the dominant system, land has been converted into private real estate. This means there really is no social control, and it makes it very difficult to deal with the kinds of forces, let's say, that Paulo was talking about, say the destruction of the Amazon. The Amazon is being turned into private property, and as private property, they're burning the Amazon, the global commons. So we have to understand how these struggles are actually one struggle or interconnected. And that's how I'd answer that question. And the second question about how we build a global connection, I mean, that's the hardest question of all. I know Hugo Chavez, just before his death, I know about this, you know, because of inside connections, and I was in Venezuela and very much connected with what was going on there. And Chavez is particularly through Iswan Meseros, who was very much involved in the Venezuelan revolution and was a close friend. And Chavez's plan was, when he won, after winning that last election or the next election, was to create a new international, not a fifth international, because he wanted to get rid of the 1, 2, 3, 4 and that whole notion, but a new international that would look most like the first international, broad-based and not excluding political movements and parties, and create and basically, I think he could have pulled it off because of his stature, his resources. He could have gotten a new international going and making those connections. Samir Amin, who was close friend and you know, part of Monthly Review, I would consider him part of Monthly Review, and we were, and I was part of the World Forum for Alternatives. He, you know, at the end of his life, he concentrated heavily on plans for a Workers and People's International. I think that the name is important because he recognized that we can't do it simply in terms of the working class, but a Workers and People's International. And first he talked about a fifth international, then he moved towards that broader basis. I think that's important. It's consistent with an approach that incorporates indigenous peoples and all movements, and doesn't simply see things in economistic terms, but not simply in terms of an industrial proletariat, but in terms of a much broader sense of cultural and environmental movements being part of the story as well. And he was trying to initiate that. Of course, it was much harder for Samir Amin to do that without the kind of stature, political stature, and international influence that Chavez had. But nonetheless, these were important initiatives. I think that the road to the future that I'm talking about, we're told the future is barred, and Sartre said a barred future is still a future. That is, we can't consider capitalism a boundary or a barrier that can't be surmounted, which is exactly, it's the whole ideology of the system now is nothing but that capitalism is a barrier that cannot be surmounted. That's the last defense of capitalism. It has nothing really to offer except the elimination of a future. Ironically, it tells us that even if we're looking at complete global catastrophe, we have to stay with capitalism. We can't leave the burning house. And but a new international is a way of signaling to the world and bringing movements together that says that, yeah, there is a future and we're going to make it. We have to, humanity will struggle for this, whether we succeed or not. We're going to see hundreds and millions and billions of people entering in this struggle for the chain of human generations, because there is actually, to turn Margaret Thatcher's phrase around, there is no alternative. It is ruin or revolution. We have to, as Paulo says, if we, just contemplate the losing of the Amazon. I live in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, and we just had the highest temperatures on record, 111 in my Fahrenheit in Eugene, where I live, and people and one of the hottest places in our Earth was British Columbia, and we were seeing people die of the heat, particularly migrant farm workers, which is a statement in itself. But we have to respond to this. It's too late to do anything else, and humanity always struggles, and when it's necessary, and we're always imaginative and revolutionary when it's necessary, and this is what's going to happen in this decade, in the next decade. And so that's my best answer to this.
We have some questions from the Chinese audience. Maybe I read it out in the chat room. Could you please tell us your views on high technologies such as 5G and artificial intelligence? Do you think that if this technology could lead to upgrading of productivity, that there can be a new form of society different from capitalism? And also, another questions in the Q&A, I would like to ask, dear Mr. Foster, I would like to ask how to engage the urban and agriculture movement to face capitalism. They have different space characteristics. Their working times are different. Besides, the different histories and specific demands will impact the engagement process. Then how to make them engage in a movement?
In terms of technology, the usual response of the system is that all our problems, let's say the problem of climate change, is technological. And of course, it's correct that we need to implement new technologies to deal with our problems. But the argument of the system is that the answers to all our problems now are purely technological. And that's because the argument is that the forces of production can be changed. The technology can be changed in that sense. But the system argues against any change in the social relations of production, that is, in the property relations. So I always tell my students that if you think about science fiction, like the old Star Trek, particularly the first Star Trek, which probably everybody is familiar with, the way they did it is that basically the social relations remained the same. The property relations, everything was the same in terms of social relations. So they disguised that partly by being on a spaceship, but the technology had changed, but the social relations was the same. In the Star Trek, the women were still wearing miniskirts the way they were in the 1960s, and the social relations had not evolved one iota, and it's particularly the gender relations, but they had all this new technology, and that's the way the future is projected to us. Capitalism is permanent, but we have better machines, as if all technological possibilities exist within the present system, which is false. So one of the things to understand is that we can't that a lot of the technologies that we need are limited by the social relations of the system. We could have developed solar power much more rapidly. In fact, China is developing it more rapidly than any other country on earth. But we could have developed it much more rapidly if the social relations didn't get in the way, because solar power is not as profitable. It's simply, for a whole lot of reasons, solar energy is not as profitable as fossil fuels. And that is then what determines the technological path of the system. And other technology, various technologies that we could introduce, various things we could do in that realm are off grounds. It's not always true that the highest form of technology is always the best, or what we call high technology. That is the newest technology. Sometimes the old technologies are more efficient, particularly in an ecological rather than an economic sense, than the old ones, than the new ones. Agribusiness is a very inefficient way to grow food or utilize land. So on ecological terms and in terms of feeding people unlimited land, the agricultural techniques that are heavily fossil fuel and based and so on, and use heavy machinery and so on, they're actually less efficient in producing food per acre. So we have to see that this is a complicated thing. The reason that agribusiness is promoted is because it makes more profits, because it saves on labor power, and that's the route to profits. But in terms of, if your goal is production of food, it's not the best path. So we have to understand that technology is mediated by social systems. If we have different social relations, we're able to develop technologies differently, better, maybe more rational. We'll be able to follow a sustainable path of sustainable human development. We need to, in terms of climate change and issues like that, we have to move towards solar power and wind power, to alternative energies. But the main obstacle to that is the profit system itself. And so it's the social relations that are getting in our way. And we have to then have a dual approach that addresses the social relations, that changes the system, which requires really revolutionary action. And we have to use technology too. But we shouldn't be unscientific about technology. Science is broader than technology. Not all technologies are appropriate. Not all technologies are good. It has to be controlled by the scientific understanding and by people's needs. And I think that is much more effectively accomplished in a socialist system. In terms of the urban and agricultural struggles, bringing the urban and rural movements together, of course, that's not an easy thing. But it may be that this whole issue of the environmental proletariat that I'm throwing out, and I have to say, which I didn't say in my remarks, that the idea hasn't caught on. I mean, I've been throwing out this notion, but it hasn't been taken up by other people to any extent at the present time. But I think it's objectively we're going this way. Basically, workers, people who are urban populations, are more and more involved in environmental struggles, in environmental justice struggles. And of course, it doesn't, I don't have to prove to you that agricultural workers, agricultural sector, rural populations, migrant agricultural workers and so on are involved in environmental struggles. And I think that we're seeing we're seeing a commonality develop. It's not easy, it's not fast, but more and more we're seeing that working populations, workers are recognizing their connections to rural struggles. When I was in Brazil a number of times, I was interested in none of the MST, the landless workers movement, also has an urban counterpart, also called the MST, which is all about, where they take over land or buildings, but in what I saw, they took over land in urban areas like soccer fields to have a place to live. And I was struck by how similar in some ways the urban struggles were to the rural struggles. And we see more and more of that in different ways now. The separation is dissolving as people in the urban areas, workers recognize that clean air is important or more important than wage increases, right? And they begin to understand the value of rural areas and rural reconstruction, and to defend that and to try to reconnect to that. So I think we're seeing those sorts of developments. It may sound optimistic, but these are real trends. Whether they develop the way we would like or not, they are objective trends, and we should throw ourselves into these combined struggles and overlapping perspectives.
We have 2 more questions from Chinese audience. I will read it out in the chat room. How should we view the overall eruption of COVID-19 in the capitalist world? Can it be seen as the helplessness of capitalism in face of major ecological ecological cycle, and would provide a juncture for the proletariat revolutionary post-pandemic? And with regard to social governance, would we have your views on democracy and collectivism, please? Do you think that true democracy or thorough democracy can be realized in the future society? Is it a possible form of social governance that can resist capitalism and revive ecological economy?
The first question, how we should view the eruption of COVID-19 in the capitalist world and its helplessness in this pandemic cycle. I mean, of course, everybody knows the statistics. If you look at China, I'm probably about a month behind on this, but in China, a few thousand people, maybe around 5,000 people have died from COVID-19. In the United States, it's well over 600,000, maybe 650,000 at this time. And we see a real divergence in the world, particularly between socialist-oriented societies, economies, and the capitalist ones in terms of response to the crisis. And yeah, I think that in some ways helplessness is in the capitalist world is appropriate term, in the sense that there are a number of factors at play. First of all, profits are more important than people. So the system hasn't really made you know, an absolute priority, and it's not structured to make people an absolute priority in this. And so the attitude now in many countries, in the United States and so on, is sort of, well, all these people have died. That's too bad. It's not, people die, and you see this kind of attitude, and we're going to develop a herd immunity, and we have our vaccines, and the most important thing is to keep our economy going. And so there's that attitude, which you see from top to bottom in the society, basically a contempt for human life, even in societies that say that they stand for individual rights and human being. There's this absolute contempt. And we can see this countries like the United States and Brazil, and I mean, it's not just the developed capitalist states, but there's also other factors. For example, there is no real public health system in the United States. What used to exist, which was paltry in terms of public health institutions, has been completely demolished under in the period of neoliberalism. So there's just there weren't enough hospital beds. There's no people couldn't get initially, they couldn't get masks. The whole medical infrastructure is designed on a profit basis. So in the United States, we always say, I mean, the government always says, the media always says, the United States has the best health system in the world. And I sometimes say to students in my class, yeah, the United States has the best health system in the world, according to the criteria that by which that is judged in our society, and that is profits. So the United States has the most profitable health system in the world. The problem is, from a social standpoint, is that the United States has low and, has declining life expectancy. All the health indicators in the United States are at the very bottom of the industrialized world. There is no real, they've improved it marginally, but overall, a large part of the population is not covered by health insurance, and so on. And there's the social protections don't exist. In my city where I live, there are thousands of people living in tents. You drive around the city, there are homeless people in tents in masses, hundreds in one place, hundreds in another place. You go from street to street. There's masses of homeless people, no provisions for them, and this is in an economy that supposedly is recovering, but it's a reality of life, the disparity between rich and poor, and the lack of protections for people at the bottom. So it's not just helplessness, because there is the power to do things more effectively, but it's not the way the system operates. The system chooses to put profits before people and before the environment. And there is a kind of possessive individualist ideology in the society that's been promoted by the system, where people think that anything that enters into that would be effective in preventing the spread of COVID-19 is an intrusion on individual rights. And that's a kind of ideology that's promoted by the system that actually facilitates the death of a large part of the population. You know, it's part of this kind of survival of the fittest, social Darwinist ideology that the United States still has. So these are social choices and have to be fought against. The issue of democracy is actually very complex. And I think that we owe it to Joe Biden, who is now talking about setting up a democracy summit. His advisors said, don't do that. And but he's trying to set up a democracy summit. I don't know when it's going to be held. But the reason his advisors told him not to do it is because the moment they set up their democracy summit, where they'll invite a few so-called Western democracies and a whole lot of dictatorships to the, you know, that they consider to be on their side to the table. I'm sure Bolsonaro will be invited, and the moment they have a democracy summit, the world will look at this more closely, and will do what we should have been doing for a long time, questioning this hegemonic view of democracy, where which isn't democracy at all. So-called, you know, a system of representative government where you where the population elects elects individuals who are chosen by political parties that are actually private corporations and are mediated by money. They choose between one or another candidate offered by them, and then once they're elected, they have no responsibility to their constituency. The population doesn't actually belong to political parties in any sort of meaningful way, except for that one vote. There's no political participation at all. This is a system that is really a plutocracy that presents itself as a democracy. And there are all sorts of alternative models that are more democratic because they involve more popular participation that actually engage the people. In Latin America, they're instituting, when the left comes to power, they're instituting constitutional reforms that remove these kind of oligarchic, so-called democratic structures and create more democratic forms of electoral structure. But there are all sorts of things. There's the communal state in Venezuela, where they tried to at least took a lot. They basically gave the population a lot more political power within their communities. And that's what people are defending in that revolution. There are all sorts of societies where they engage popular participation. In China, one of the most democratic aspects is what is known as the mass line, which is not really understood in the West, but is aimed at a kind of participation that involves two directions, from below and from above. And I think that there are all sorts of ways of developing a democracy, but democracy has to start with people's fundamental rights. Democracy can't mean that populations are left to die, or that their conditions of existence are fundamentally destroyed. Democracy cannot mean a society structured on on racism. So we need to talk about what democracy is, and democracy can't be a system that's ruled by money. In the United States, the humorist, a famous humorist in the 1930s said that we have the best Congress that money can buy. And that's really kind of the nature of the U.S. government. It's the money that dictates most decisions, and it has very little relation to what people want. In fact, there is an inverse relation, if you look at the polls, between what people say they want and what the government does, because what the government does is determined by not by the population, but by the corporations. So I don't believe that's democracy. And as if we create more radical, broader based, more revolutionary movements with broad participation, we can reinvigorate democracy, get back to what it historically really meant.
We have a question from Kinchi. And you have stressed the issue of ecology for a long time and have written extensively about Marxism and ecology. However, it seems few or only a few Marxists stress this. What do you think is the underlying reason?
I actually think it's changed, that the what we call ecological Marxism or eco-socialism is actually the most vital aspect of Marxism now throughout the world, in terms of new ideas and in terms of writings and what's going on. So that's spread all over the globe. There are these old interpretations of historical materialism that are economically determinist. We have to hold on to some of that. I mean, the critique of political economy is vital. In fact, I write about the economics too. I write about books on economic crisis, and I've spent most of my life dealing with that. But and we have to hold on to that critique, but we can't afford a rigidly economic determinist view. We have to recognize this broader conception of materialism. We have to recognize that was the original basis of historical materialism. And we're seeing this recognized everywhere. I mean, all the movements that I mentioned recognize this. Most of the debates on Marxism are about these issues now. I was noticing, let's say, in terms of the Deutscher Prize, which is the leading prize for Marxist theory in the West. Most of the, I think something like, if you looked at the last 10 years, half of the awards have gone to people who are advancing eco-socialist views. In terms of China, ecological civilization and ecological Marxism are very, very big parts of the discussion. You look at Venezuela, even in its conditions, but they recognize that they have to have an eco-socialist perspective to be able to defend their society. I think the MST in Brazil. So this is really the way Marxism is going. Marxism is often interpreted in very narrow terms that are somewhat Eurocentric, and so some Marxists ignore third world struggles altogether, and peasant struggles and indigenous struggles, but they're, I think, increasingly a minority, increasingly ignored, because globally Marxism itself is moving in very much in an ecological direction, not forgetting all the things that we knew before, but adding to it and deepening it. Basically, ecological approach is not a shift in a different direction. It's simply deepening the materialist critique. It's not abandoning what we knew before, but it's recognizing that we have to deepen and broaden our analysis if we're going to create the kinds of revolutions that are necessary in the 21st century. I made one error, I think, in my talk. I referred to the peasant revolution as the 15th century, I believe, and it was 16th century, and I think I just slipped there and wanted to correct that.
We have one more comments and questions. There were recent economic data from the United States indicating that it is almost back to full employment and salary level is rising rapidly. Why are there still so many homeless people? Does that mean those people have simply been dropped from employment force?
You know, the dominant perspective, the dominant condition in the US economy for about half a century and worsening over time has been economic stagnation. So very, very slow rates of growth. The rate of growth has been around 2% or less, and it's gone down. It's the average rate of growth has been declining pretty decade by decade, and now the growth rate, if you looked at the last decade, is it's less than 2%, I believe, but it's the unemployment figures are not that meaningful because they can say, well, the employment is going up. We've had the deepest recession during the pandemic. The COVID-19 recession is deeper than the great financial crisis was. But the unemployment is going down, or employment is going up. But the statistics aren't very meaningful because so many people have dropped out of the labor force or being pushed out of the labor force. And so, like I was saying, in where I'm living in Eugene, there's homeless people everywhere. There's tent cities all over the city. It looks like the 1930s. When you look back at the old films of the 1930s, where you had all of these 10 cities, that's what it looks like. And these are masses of people who've dropped out of the labor force. And businesses are now offering increased wages because they can't get workers because so many have dropped out of the labor force and are living kind of marginal level. And once they're out of the labor force, they don't really come back very easily for various reasons. People, the younger workers are living with their parents and living off of the parents' income. There's there's been a big they're increasing wages under compulsion. And it's very important because wages are stagnated. Real wages in the United States in 2018 were at the same level as they were in 1964. I don't know if you can think back to when 1964 was, but the real wages in the United States are the same level that they were at a half century, more than a half century ago. They have not increased. The federal minimum wage hasn't been increased in a dozen years. The situation for workers, the declining labor share has been a major aspect. Labor share has been declining for 50 years. So this is a really difficult situation. The economy is functioning on the demand side, and what they call it a K-shaped recovery. So a V-shaped recovery like China has, if you go down and then you come back up really quickly, that's a V-shaped recovery. They're calling this a K-shaped recovery. And that means there's a recovery for the rich and there isn't a recovery for the poor. People are getting some kind of unemployment compensation on a large scale, and they don't want to go to work because of when they're getting that, because they're so super exploited at work, so heavily exploited. But there's also this situation where millions of people are facing eviction because of unpaid rent. There was the moratorium on the paying of rent, and millions of people are facing eviction or threatened with eviction because that rent that they didn't pay, they now have to pay all at once, which they can't do. So the Biden administration has pushed that back a month. But people are scared. They're getting evicted from their homes. Meanwhile, the government has put the interest rates down to 0, which has caused speculation in housing, which is the houses are being bought up massively. House prices are going up. The working population can't afford to buy houses. And if you rent, you're losing. And now those who rent are facing eviction. It's a very difficult situation, and if you any pretense that this is just a fast or normal recovery, or that somehow employment is simply improving, or wages are simply going up, it misses the overall context of basically the devastation of the U.S. economy. Capacity utilization, unused excess capacity, unused productive capacity is enormous in the society. This is so it's a period of economic stagnation, and they're saying that under Biden things are improving, that there's economic recovery, but basically, I mean, there's naturally going to be an economic recovery as a result of the pandemic, but the overall structural conditions are, the structural problems are worse than they were before, and they were already serious.
We have questions from Brazilian friends, Beatrice. Conservative right-wing parties and some religious leaders have used the mass media to spread the idea that socialism denies human rights. Of course, this is completely false, but this way of presenting socialism has been effective for an important part of Western society. We have to face this challenge. What is your opinion about this? Political education of the masses is a huge challenge. How do you see this problem? And one comment on maybe from our Mexican friends, but she speaks in Spanish. Maybe Paulo can help us to read it out.
Eugenia wrote that in Mexico, the ecologist peasants were fighting for the land and the water are disappearing and assassinated.
Yeah, there's socialism denying human rights, and of course that's said in Brazil, it's said everywhere. This is the propaganda system. I mean, you can see it at its most stark in today's imperialism. We have perpetual warfare. We've had basically perpetual warfare led by the United States since the early 1990s, since the demise of the Soviet Union, during the period when the United States was what we call the unipolar moment. That is when the United States had unrivaled hegemonic power over the world, and this has resulted in really perpetual warfare. And the so-called right to protect, which was part of this, what they call the rules-based international order, instituted, which the United States and NATO, its allies, invade countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe, in Eastern Europe, and so on, with coups in Latin America, with the with the justification that they're intervening on a human rights basis, and the death and destruction and the corruption of the governments that they put in place. Look at Libya. Look at Iraq. This is not about human rights. And what is it? What are your human rights when you live in a country that where you don't have health insurance, so you die? I had a student of mine who got cancer, and she died because she had no health insurance. And I just watched her die. She couldn't get any help. And the reason, she was a graduate student, and graduate students, once they finish their funds, they can teach, and they get health insurance during the terms that they are teaching. But she took a term off from teaching. Either I can't remember what the reason was. Maybe she wasn't offered a course, or maybe she wanted to take a term off, and she got cancer during the term she wasn't teaching, when she had no health insurance. And so I just watched her die. She just there was no a way that she could get assistance. Now, is that where does that fit into human rights? And we see this all the time. Or look at the Black Lives Matter movement. If you're Black, if you're a Black male, and if you're a Black male, you're more likely to be shot by the police for essentially no reason at all. Sometimes in a kind of a form of lynching. And where's your rights? So the question is, how is the society set up? In this society, if you have money, you have rights. If you don't have money, it's much more problematic. And to set itself up as the standard for human rights in the world is, I think, hypocritical at best.
This last
question posed by Beatriz about what is happening in Brazil. Regarding the dissemination of fake news, on the distortion of socialism, of communism, fake stories are created about them. And there is a strong group that uses social media which are financed by great capitalists. And they use robots to disseminate those ideas. And there is why there is a group that supports the current president. He and his family do all those same things as well. And all that politics against denying the virus is being held, that virus which has already killed hundreds and thousands of people, and they keep on spreading ideas that have to do with meds that don't work effectively. It's a whole network of corruption that appeared right now as well. In some vaccination or purchase of over-invoiced vaccines, there were vaccines that were acquired for supposedly $10, and in the end they cost 15. So it's a quite complicated scheme we are facing right now. I don't know if that was Beatriz meant, but right now, apart from this whole situation, together with the Lula and Dilma administration, there was a campaign also against socialism, to withdraw socialism from power as well, apart from Lula and Dilma. So we're living through a time where there's a social struggle that was hidden, but now emerged. The right wing, the extreme right wing is emerging, is appearing more with all these speeches, these fake news in political terms. Or in relation to the pandemics. And it seems it seems to be a difficult task, but I think this moment is really important, because if the class struggle is hidden, the contradictions will burden more. So we need that those contradictions that are at the basis of the society of the great inequality in which we are living, the growth of poverty of the population, violation, everyday violence we live, that will emerge more frequently. So I don't think it's a problem of political education of masses, Beatriz. The masses are feeling this. But there's a group of 15% of the population, or at least of those that are interviewed in the service, who are supporting this government and this way of making politics, doing politics. So that's what I wanted to say.